Here's something I can tell you with a historian's confidence. Most of the fantasy kingdoms you've ever read would fall apart inside a year. Not because the magic is wrong or the map is off, those are usually fine. It's the power. The crown that sits there unquestioned and obeyed, paying for armies with money that never seems to come from anywhere. I studied the real thing for years, and the gap between how power works on the page and how it worked in life is enormous. So I'm starting a series to look at fantasy world building with the lens of a historian. And we're opening with political mistakes that many writers would never recognize on their own. The simplest way that I can describe the first mistake is this. Power and personality are two different things, and fantasy keeps treating them as one. A king can be wise and fair, a genuinely good man, and still hold a throne nobody alive can challenge. He can also be a tyrant whose grip falls apart the moment he shows weakness. How good the man is and how much power he actually commands have almost nothing to do with each other. The good king, however, is what you get when a writer nails the first and never notices the second exists. What you have to understand is that his personality never mattered here. What mattered was the chair, more specifically. What a throne actually is underneath whoever happens to be sitting on it. And the answer to that, the one a history degree drags you to eventually, is that a throne is not a place you give orders from. It's a place you bargain from. You see, there's a famous version of this complaint, and it comes from inside the fantasy genre. George R.R. Martin once asked about Aragorn. What was his tax policy? Did he keep a standing army? What did he do in a year of flood or famine? People sometimes hear that as a cheap shot at Tolkien. I'd argue that it isn't. Martin's real point was that a story can lean on a very old, very comforting idea, that if the man on the throne is good, the land will be good too. But real history just never ran that way. Being a good guy, he said, was never the answer. You had to make hard decisions. And here's what I'd add to this. Most of those decisions weren't even moral ones. They were structural. What I mean by that is that the decisions that mattered, more often than not, were about whose door you had to go knock on, hat in hand, to get anything done at all. Just for a moment, picture a real king who wants a war. Maybe it's even a good war because one of the kingdom's borders has been raided and his people are dying. So the cause is clean. But that still doesn't mean the king can actually go to war here. He lacks the power to simply declare it because the soldiers he needs aren't his. They belong to a dozen great lords who keep their own armed men, and every one of those lords is quietly doing the arithmetic on what marching off to die for the crown will cost him, and what he'll get back. And that dependency forces the king on the road, traveling to gather support for his cause. He sits at their tables and flatters and reminds them of debts they'd rather forget. One lord wants his daughter married up the ladder, another wants a rival's land signed over in the dark. A third just wants to watch the king sweat, because making a king sweat is the most fun he'll have all year. And the money is its own small humiliation, because by long custom the king can't raise a tax across the whole realm without the agreement of the very men he's trying to lean on. He needs them to pay for the thing he needs them to fight. So the bottom line is that the person sitting on that shiny throne doesn't actually command. They negotiate, and they usually do so from a worse position than it looks. So the fix is almost mechanical. Give your monarch at least one power center that can actually challenge him properly, and then make him deal with it. This has to be more than just an advisor who frowns and gets overruled 2 lines later. A real challenge. Maybe it's the lords who own the soldiers. Maybe it's a church whose blessing decides whether the common people see him as a true king or a thief in a borrowed crown. Pick one or both, and make the king dependent on it. Watch what that does to a single scene. The flat version reads like this. King Almor raised the new tax and the realm paid. You can't build drama on that because there's nothing in it but compliance. Now run the same moment through real power. Almor still needs the tax, that part hasn't changed. But now, for example, the great houses collect the levies in their own lands. So he can't see a single copper without their cooperation. He gets 3 of his 5 biggest lords to agree, and only after he marries his ward to one of them and promises a disputed border keep to another. This isn't the end of the story though. The 2 who refuse don't just walk away, they walk away together. Suddenly they've become a faction, and they've just learned exactly how much leverage they hold over a king who needs their money. Do you see exactly what happened here? We didn't have to bolt that conflict on to make things interesting. It was already sitting inside the tax. A king who can never be told no doesn't read as strong. He reads as a man nobody bothered to argue with, which is to say, a man who isn't really ruling anything. And if that move, spot the flaw, then fix it right there on the page, is the kind of thing your writing brain perks up at, I keep a whole free library of it called the Fantasy Writing Remedies. 40 of the most common problems in fantasy writing. Each one sitting right next to its fix, no sign up, just there in the description below. Anyway, back to the throne room. Fear works, let's get that on the table first. Because the coldest-eyed political minds in history all knew it. And there's no sense pretending otherwise. A frightened population is a quiet one. Simple as that. Dread keeps people in their houses, keeps the taxes moving, keeps the rebellion everyone's privately imagining from ever actually happening. The Dark Lord whose name people won't say out loud comes from somewhere real. So when a writer builds an empire on terror, that isn't the naive part. The naive part is what comes next. Because the same hard thinkers who admitted fear is useful added a warning in the very next breath, and fantasy almost always quotes the first half and forgets the second. Fear is fine, but being hated is not. The moment a ruler's subjects cross from frightened into genuinely unanimously loathing him, the fear stops shielding him and starts ticking down. A man everyone fears can rule for decades. A man everyone hates is one bad winter from a crowd at his gate. So the cartoon version of Tyrant, who sits 1,000 years on his throne while every living soul in the realm despises him, fails its own logic. By rights, it should have come apart in 2 generations, which means there has to be something else holding it up. And before we get to what that something is, there's a question every regime has to answer whether it likes the question or not. Why does anyone obey on an ordinary Tuesday when nobody's holding a blade to them? Sometimes the answer is just habit. It has always been this bloodline ruling the kingdom. Nobody alive remembers an alternative, and that sheer inertia is sturdier than any law. Sometimes it's the person, a leader so magnetic that people attach to the man instead of the office. And sometimes it's the machinery itself, courts and offices and records that keep grinding on no matter who dies. A real regime usually runs on some blend of the 3. Strip all of them away, and your tyrant, no matter how terrifying you make him, turns out to be a man whose power evaporates the second the guards get bored and wander off. At that moment, he isn't frightening anymore. He's exposed. So here's the real engine, the one that actually keeps an ugly regime upright. We got to look past the people who fear it and find the people who feed off it. Walk through the tyrant's capital and find them one by one. There's the clerk who was born nobody, in a gutter the histories won't bother to name, and who now runs a whole province's grain accounts because the new order swept the old families out and needed someone clever to fill the empty desks. He owes the regime the entire shape of his life. Then there's the priest who set the crown on the tyrant's head. The day the throne falls, his authority falls with it. And that jumped-up lord rattling around a manor he took from the family that used to own it? He sleeps badly because he knows that family is still out there somewhere, remembering what he did, waiting for a chance of revenge. Not one of these people loves the man on the throne. A few of them might privately even hope he chokes on his wine. But every one of them would fight to keep him where he is. Because the sum is simple. Whatever comes after him is very likely worse for them than the status quo. That's the important difference between everyone hates him and a throne with something solid underneath it. And once you can see those people, you can also see where the real danger lives. Forget the plucky rebels out in the woods. The threat is inside the regime's own supporters. The clerk and the priest, for example, likely want incompatible things. The clerk wants slow, grey stability, years of it, long enough for his new status to set like concrete and pass down to his children. The priest wants doctrine enforced now, in public, with the impure named and punished where the crowds can see. And that kind of zeal is exactly the upheaval the clerk needs to avoid. Neither man is the regime's enemy. On the contrary, they're both part of its backbone. But the day the tyrant looks weak by losing a battle or a failed harvest, each of them starts privately pricing out whether there's a better side to be on. That's the kind of collapse that's far harder to stop than a rebel army, because it's wearing the regime's own colors. So ultimately what I'm getting at here is that a regime is a coalition, not a mood. And you should hold on to that, because everything I've said so far quietly assumes the ruler is alive. The single most dangerous day in the life of any throne, however, is the one where he isn't. Let's say the old king actually died. He's been dead for nothing more than a couple of hours, and the Great Hall is already a battlefield despite every sword still sheathed. The king's brother stands in one corner, saying loudly that the king's teenage son is far too young and somebody steady ought to hold the realm in trust. Meaning himself, of course. The dead king's widow holds the other corner, her family packed in close around her son. Because if the boy rules, then she rules. And everyone standing in that room knows it. A border lord nobody invited has turned up with a suspicious amount of armed men, noticeably more than a grieving guest needs. And then there's the high priest who hasn't said a single word which is its own kind of speech because nothing becomes official without the man who performs the coronation. In the middle of all these people, there's the throne, the seat that everyone here desires, and yet not one person in the hall can simply stroll over and sit down in it. That's roughly the history George R.R. Martin was grounding his A Song of Ice and Fire series on, by the way. Real successions were chaos engines. They involved disputed claims, child kings, regents, pretenders, rival houses, a crown nobody held cleanly because a clean hold is a story the winner writes afterward. Now set that against the version fantasy reaches for on Reflex. The king dies, his eldest is crowned, and the realm mourns. Then the realm moves on, and the story waits politely for the next plot to show up. That one sentence, something like, "The kingdom mourned, and Prince Edran took up his father's crown," quietly switches off the most reliable source of conflict a writer will ever be handed for free. A throne changing hands is about as close as politics gets to a guaranteed storm, and the clean succession reflex ignores all of it. The same instinct turns up at the council table, and it's worth catching there too because it hides better. Everyone tends to remember giving the king advisors. These people then lean over maps, they murmur their counsel, raise the occasional objection, and then the king decides whatever he was always going to decide with everyone falling into line. All that makes the advisors is a form of ambient noise because they don't perform an actual job. The fix is to hand at least one of them something the king genuinely needs and can't simply seize. Give the general soldiers who cheer for him and not for the boy on the throne, and let the whole room feel it. Give the treasurer sole knowledge of where the money actually is. Put a young ruler in a room with 2 or 3 people built like that, and you don't have to invent the tension. He's already cornered by people who never promised him a thing. The version of this I keep pointing people to, the way I read it anyway, is the kind of world where power is split so deliberately that nobody can move alone. There's a ruler, yes, but there's also an assembly of great houses that can band together against him the instant he overreaches. And a third party sitting on a monopoly over the one resource the whole system runs on. Every move is a negotiation between at least 2 of them. The ruler can't just do things, he has to bring someone else along for every single one. Which means the politics is woven through every chapter instead of bolted onto a few. So the fix for both mistakes is really one question, and you ask it at every succession and every big decision. Who else has a claim, a grudge, or an army? Then you make at least 2 of them act on it. Let me come back to the old version of the king's death. That was Prince Edran taking the crown, the kingdom mourned and moved on. But now factor in everything I just said while still building from the very same death. Suddenly, the late king's brother grabs a regency before the body's gone cold. The widow's family closes ranks around the boy to keep their grip on him. And a border lord, watching all of it from a distance, simply stops paying his taxes that same week. Not in open rebellion, just to see who's strong enough to ride out and make him. You have one death that turned into 3 factions, and a plot that was hiding inside the premise the entire time, waiting for you to quit tiding it away. And honestly, this is the spot where a lot of writers feel the floor tilt, because fixing politics one mistake at a time is patchwork. You're shoring up a structure that's already built. If you'd rather build it right from the start with the factions and the power and the history load-bearing before you ever type chapter 1, that's the whole idea behind my upcoming world-building system. 10 modules for the full architecture of your world. It's on a founder pre-order right now before it launches in August, so if that's where your head's at, you find out more via the link in the description below. Either way, stick with me, because there's one mistake left, and it's the strangest of the 4. So here's the strange thing. Everything we've covered, the bargaining, the coalition, the contested throne, still quietly assumes the kingdom is a machine that runs itself in the background while the important people fight over who gets to steer. And that assumption is the last mistake, the one almost nobody flags, because it doesn't look like a mistake at all. It looks like a setting. In this world, nothing ever really changes. The empire has stood for 3,000 years. The treasury is simply full, and the army simply loyal with nobody in the story ever seeming to ask why. If you actually ask the obvious question, who turns the gears? The whole world stops making sense. This is the deep version of that tax question from the very start. Not who sits on the throne, who counts the grain, who writes down what's owed, who carries the king's law to a village 3 weeks' ride from the capital, and what happens to them when they get there. Strip the crown and the map away, and a kingdom is really just thousands of small, dull, breakable jobs. And the fantasy that skips them hands you an empty realm while calling it a peaceful one. Even in the romantic version of a peaceful kingdom, those jobs still exist. Someone still has to perform them. And the second you start filling those jobs in, the story begins generating itself. Let me walk you through the kind of chain I mean, because this is where it gets good. Start with something boring. A tax on grain to feed the capital. To collect it, the crown leans on provincial clerks, local men, underpaid, caught between a quota from above they cannot possibly hit, and a governor who does not, under any circumstances, want to hear bad news. So for years, quietly, they fudge it. They write down the harvest the capital wants to see, instead of the one that actually came in, and they squeeze the gap out of the villages to make the numbers add up. It holds, the way these things hold, right up until the year the real harvest fails. Now the quota is pure fiction and the villages have already been stripped of everything they had. The clerks panic and send the collectors out anyway. And one of those collectors rides into a village that genuinely has nothing left, and stands there demanding payment in the name of a king 400 miles away who has never once spent a thought on this place. Tipped to their breaking point, somebody in that crowd picks up a stone, and that's it. That's where your rebellion actually begins. Not with a prophecy or a lost heir, but with a tax ledger that had been lying for 6 years until, eventually, those lies came to light. So picture the before one last time with me in its full glory. The sunlit empire had stood 3,000 years in peace under the god emperors, and all its people were content. That sentence sounds like world building, but it shuts the door on every story the world could ever tell, at least in regard to what we've just discussed. Now the after version then, and notice we didn't add a villain, we just added plumbing. We have the grain tax, the cornered clerks, the lie in the ledger, the failed harvest, the collector in the empty village, the first stone, and then the second. And while all of that is boiling over, an ambitious general 100 miles off hears that the provinces are burning and the capital is distracted, and begins to wonder how loyal his soldiers really are to a throne that can't even feed its own people. One boring tax just produced a peasant revolt and a legitimacy crisis deep enough to hand that general his opening. And every thread of it grew straight out of how the world works, instead of being dropped in from above. And now the thing I cannot omit here, because at the very start I told you most fantasy kingdoms would fall apart inside a year, and I owe you the catch on that. That statement is spot on for the kingdoms chasing realism and missing it. But a kingdom chasing myth and fully committing to it is playing a different game. And that difference is the whole point. Which is why I don't want you walking out of here thinking the answer is just be more like Martin and stuff a ledger into every chapter. There's a real counter-argument, and it's older than fantasy itself. That idea Martin poked at, the one about the assumption that a good king automatically leads to a land flourishing, isn't always a failure of realism. For most of human history, it was a genuine sacred belief that the rightful ruler and the health of the land were one and the same thing, that a true king's very presence made the fields come green and the sick come well again. When a king in a story lays his hands on the dying and heals them, the writer usually hasn't forgotten about tax policy. They're reaching for that ancient idea on purpose. Tolkien knew precisely what he was doing. The healer king is myth doing exactly what myth is built to do, and reading it as an economics error misses the whole point. So here's the rule that ties all 4 mistakes together, and it has nothing to do with copying Martin. It's this: pick your mode and honor its contract. If you're writing myth, if your story runs on destiny and rightful kings and a land that answers to the worthy, then lean all the way into it, and nobody is owed a tax policy. That's just the genre doing its job. But if you're writing the grounded kind of fantasy, the realpolitik kind, the kind that promises the reader a world of real power and real consequences, then you have to actually hand over the machinery. You see, the actual problem here was never about realism at all. For many writers, the problem is simply that they promise the reader a grounded world of real power and hard choices, and then the reader waves their hands at how that power actually works. And they feel that broken promise even when they can't name it. These are the 4 most common political problems I see in fantasy. The good king who never has to bargain for anything. The empire propped on fear instead of a coalition with something to lose. The throne that changes hands without a fight, ringed by a council that exists to not. And the kingdom that runs on nothing at all, with no hands anywhere near the gears. 4 mistakes, 1 root: power that costs nothing, answers to no one, and maintains itself. Flip that root, and your politics stops being set dressing and starts driving the whole story. So pick your mode and honor its contract. The rest is just paying close attention to who's really holding the crown up. And if you need a bit more inspiration for the foundation of your political system, then don't miss the next video where I break down 7 of the most bizarre political systems in history, including one where being a slave is the best opportunity to end up ruling everything.